Hello, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the New York Historical Society's Climate Lab, a feature of the New Amsterdam Project. My name is Russell Shorto. I am the director of the New Amsterdam Project. We have been doing this for a year or so, producing events with experts on one aspect or another of New York and how it deals with climate and resiliency issues. Usually these are in person, but today, for some not very interesting reasons, we are coming to you via Zoom. The downside, obviously, is we're not able to interact in person, but this does give us the chance to present some nice visuals, which you will be seeing shortly. I would like to invite audience members to submit questions throughout the conversation using the Q&A feature. You can submit anytime. This is a special climate lab because we are featuring our neighbors on Central Park West, Central Park and the Central Park Conservancy. Recently, we had a climate lab with the organization New Yorkers for Parks, in which project manager Daniel Abram and New York City Council member Shekhar Krishnan discussed the plan to hold the city's feet to the fire on the promise to devote 1% of the city budget to its parks. In the process, they covered the many roles that the city's parks play: recreation, but also sustainability, reducing flooding, lowering air temperature, and generally making the city more resilient. Today, we zero in on Central Park, and my guests are admirably suited to outlining the past, present, and future of what many would consider New York's flagship park. First up, Sara Cedar Miller has been the historian emerita of the Central Park Conservancy since 2017. There she is. She was the Conservancy photographer from 1984, its historian from 1989 to 2017. She has appeared on radio and TV on the topic of Central Park and its history. In 2020, she was honored with the Preservation Hero Award by the Library of American Landscape History. She is the author of Central Park, an American Masterpiece, Strawberry Fields, Central Park's Memorial to John Lennon, Seeing Central Park, the official guidebook, and most recently, Before Central Park, which I have to tell you right now, you have to go out and get. It's a lovely book. Sara, welcome. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you, Russell, and thank the New York Historical Society for hosting the Central Park Conservancy's climate initiatives. As the historian, of course, I will be taking a look backwards.
Right.
So,
and let me, you'll go first in the presentations, but let me introduce your co-presenter now as well. Michelle Mueller-Gamez is the manager of climate change research at the relatively newly established Central Park Climate Lab. Everybody has a climate lab these days. She works with the Natural Areas Conservancy, the Yale School of the Environment, and the Central Park Conservancy staff to assess the impacts of climate change on urban parkland and to advance adaptation and mitigation strategies. Michelle, welcome to you.
Thank you, Russell. I'm glad that the two climate labs are collaborating.
Exactly. Yeah, we've been talking about this for quite some time. So let me begin by just posing before you get into presentations of the park, a personal question to each of you. Basically the same question. Sara, I mean, you've been part of Central Park for nearly 40 years officially. Many of the people who are on this Zoom have their own relationship to Central Park. Can you put into words your own relationship, what the park has meant to you?
Pretty much everything. It's what I think about the moment I get up. I dream about it. And I think about it in so many different ways. My happiest moments are, of course, the personal ones when I watch my daughter cross the finish line of the New York City Marathon, or watch my grandson, you know, like everyone else, grow up in the park. I'm no different than the 42 million people who visit, who love the park, and for whom I don't know what I'd do without it.
Michelle, what was your relationship to Central Park, or for that matter, to New York's parks before you started this job?
Yeah, I feel like same as Sara, where I feel like my relationship was similar to all the visitors that come to Central Park. You know, it's a place to run, it's a place to escape, go into the woodlands, get a little bit lost. But I definitely think about urban parkland kind of at a larger scale, which is interesting to say when we're thinking about Central Park. But I really started forming my relationship, I feel like, with urban parkland out at Jamaica Bay and learning about the ecology and the resilience there. And so taking some of that knowledge and applying it to Central Park.
Okay, wonderful. Well, we build this as Central Park past, present, and future. And Sarah, as you said, the past is your domain. So do you want to kick us off with the presentation?
Sure. First slide, please. There we go. So in part, the park we see today is the result of a massive climate change that occurred when the last 2,000-mile-high glacier receded from Manhattan Island. Advancement and recession had been happening for over 90,000 years. The last glacier advance of the Laurentide ice sheet reached New York between 22 to 20,000 years ago. There was constant shifts in the climate, the most recent being the Little Ice Age that occurred in 1300 to 1800 AD. The Dutch noted that North America was so much colder than Europe, which was also colder than it had been. Next slide. Evidence of the glacier are the scratches from northwest to southeast in the park. Next slide. The glacier dumped glacial till, which is unstratified mixtures of clay, silt, sand, gravel, and boulders that receive layers of this soft material in thicknesses as slight as a few inches or as thick as 30 feet. Next slide. This is actually from the Central Park annual report, and you can see how thick or how thin those little dotted things are, the glacial till that they measured from 8th Avenue all the way to 5th Avenue. And so this is what was on the landscape when they decided to build the park. Engineer Egbert Ville in 1857, just as they were starting to build the park, he noted how difficult the landscape really was in terms of the soil. He says, quote, "The soil of Central Park contains an excess of clay, and this clay contains an excess of moisture, the consequence of which is that in damp weather, it is formed into a tenacious paste from which the water will neither evaporate nor drain off. In dry weather, it bakes, becoming almost a solid substance through which the roots cannot penetrate. In very hot or very cold weather, it cracks open, either breaking the roots or exposing them. It attracts mechanically the nutritive juices essential to vegetation and does not part with them to the plants." Next slide. And the result is these fetid swamps that covered Central Park along with the rock outcrops. Parts of these photographs that are in the collection of the New York Historical Society were taken about 1857, and parts of the park look like the surface of the moon, not a tree in sight, just barren and rocky, and you couldn't imagine a more unprepossessing landscape. Next slide. We can see the results from this substructure from the elms on the mall. In 1859, the trees were planted. By 1900, when this photograph was taken, the roots were unable to expand due to this impenetrable subsurface. The Parks Department, as a result, suggested dynamiting the trees to free them from their surrounding clay, but instead, they wisely decided to plant the trees, now 101 years old this year, that we have on the mall today. Next slide. The receding glacier also dropped millions of glacial erratics, boulders as big as a truck or as small as a football that were strewn across Manhattan Island. Next slide. The erratics are still over the park today. They were used to create 6th Avenue and 59th Street. Here you can see them all piled up for the roadbed. Next slide. And today in Central Park, I took these photographs of the glacial erratics, that big one, and the almost like a flock of sheep, and on Sheep Meadow. And then over here in the gill of the Ramble, all of them were created to be both design elements and stop erosion in the park. So they're, are reminders of the glacier that still exists in the park today. Next slide. So with little promise for agriculture or human habitation in much of it, Manhattan Island, the jagged terrain midsection, roughly 3 miles long and a half-mile wide, running from roughly 2nd Avenue to 7th Avenue, 23rd Street to 92nd Street, these great green and yellow checkerboard that you see here are the city's common land. The land was considered, quote, waste, vacant, unpatented, and unappropriated. In 1886, Royal Governor Thomas Dongan granted the vast and largely undesirable tract that now comprises Midtown, the Upper East Side, and much of Central Park to the Corporation of New York via a royal charter. It was divided into 5-acre lots for sale in 1796, and 3 roads were put through them. The middle road is today 5th Avenue, the West Road is 6th Avenue, and the East Road is Park Avenue. So the grid we have today from 1811, this is not that grid. This is the first grid that we had. So next slide, please. The receding glacier also created Manhattan's hydrology. This map by ecologist Daniel Atha shows both permanent and intermittent waterways. The dark lines are the permanent, and the lighter lines, the intermittent ones, were most affected by any climate change, and they appear on some maps, but not all maps, which shows that there was climate change. And Daniel has done a wonderful job of creating a map that puts all the layers of maps together to show you that, in fact, there were some times in the park's history, or the pre-park's history, where water disappeared and then reappeared. So next slide, please. In order to build the park, much of the landscape needed to be drained, as shown in this photograph from 1857. The drainage, it looks like a farm, but these are drainage ditches being inserted into the landscape by Olmsted and Ville when Olmsted was superintendent in the years 1857 to 1858. Next slide, please. So ecological disasters also happen, as it does today, by the hand of man. In 1777, during the Revolutionary War, British artist Archibald Robertson drew this forested area that is now Central Park around 106th Street, just before the drastic deforestation of Manhattan Island happened. Next slide. The severe weather in the winters from 1779 to 1781 froze the rivers and kept a steady snowfall from mid-November until nearly April. To keep the fires going during the constant blizzards, all trees in Manhattan Island were cut down. Manhattan was once covered in thick verdant woodlands, groves, and plantations. Then almost overnight, the wood was needed to fuel the fires of soldiers. In 1782, observing from a high point in New Jersey, George Washington wrote, quote, "The island is totally stripped of trees and wood of every kind, but low bushes, apparently as high as a man's waist, appear in places which were covered with wood in the year 1776, unquote. Ecologists Eric Sanderson and Mary Ann Brown have estimated that the areas of degraded forest and shrub covered 73% of the island in 1782. Next slide, please. The consequences were drastic. As Philip von Kraft, a Hessian mercenary, described in his diary, one of the treasures of New York Historical Society, by the way. The brutal winters were followed by harsh, dry summers. According to the environmental historian William Cronin, the deforestation made temperatures more erratic, soils drier, and drainage patterns less constant. Without trees, smaller streams and springs no longer flowed year-round. That's like Daniel's map showed us. And this brought drought. The nearby swamps of the Harlem Mere and the Harlem Creek Channel, as well as the freshwater of what is today the Loch, were dust bowls. By September 1782, von Kraft noted in his diary that the parched troops could not camp at McGowan's Pass on account of the dearth of water. And after a terrible fever and sickness that would last for months, he reported, quote, a general complaint that all men would soon die for the want of water. Now, even the best, not next slide yet, even the best of circumstances, it would take about 3 decades for the deforested woodlands to recover. And just as they had grown into a healthy woodland, they would have used the term thrifty. A good, healthy woodland was called thrifty woods. Deforestation happened in Central Park yet again 40 years later, when troops were camped on the northern part of Central Park. Valentine Nutter, who owned much of this land in 1814, was devastated that the troops cut down the trees that today make up much of the North Woods. Next slide, please. The deforestation was so significant that these lithographs, the before and this after, were created. Notice the gentleman in the lower left pointing at the deforested woodlands of what would be today Central Park. Next slide, please. Here it is, the healthy and thrifty North Woods that we have today. Next slide. From the earliest days of the park, weather has always been a concern. By 1867, the commissioners were taking readings to monitor the park. In 1865, for example, the commissioner's annual report noted that the amount of rain influenced the need to mow the lawns more frequently. By 1869, meteorologist Daniel Draper, pictured here, had connected to the U.S. Army Signal Corps Weather Bureau, and he set up an observatory in the turrets of the arsenal, where he invented, including this diagram here, many self-registering machines that were used by meteorologists throughout the country. So Central Park really has a great deal of meteorological history as well. Next slide. In 1820, the instruments were moved to Belvedere Castle and the adjacent land to its south, where they still perform that function today and are transmitted by phone lines to Brookhaven National Lab on Long Island, where the National Weather Service is now based. The only thing that is still done manually in Central Park in terms of weather is measuring the snow, which the Central Park Conservancy used to do with a yellow plastic ruler. I witnessed the measuring of the snow one day in a blizzard when I was at Belvedere Castle, and Randy, one of my colleagues, came out, stuck a yellow plastic ruler into the snow and called it into the U.S. Weather Service. Today, that function is performed by the 24-hour staff at the Central Park Zoo. So now I'm going to turn the program over to my colleague, Michelle Mueller-Gamez, who will talk to you about our initiatives today. Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah. I thought I would ground us in just some observations of climate change in New York City. And so I pulled some statistics from the New York City Panel on Climate Change, who got a lot of this data from Central Park. But just to note that mean annual temperature in New York City has increased 4.4 degrees since 1900 to 2011. So that was when they last reported it. And there's also been increases in mean annual precipitation by 7.7 inches from the year 1900 to 2011. And then sea level at the Battery has increased 1.1 feet since 1900. So Just to note that there are observational changes of our climate. Something that really sticks out to me is just the loss of days below freezing as that impacts our ecology. At the same time, we're getting more intense heat waves, heavier downpours, coastal flooding is likely to increase in frequency, and we're also experiencing some increased periods of droughts. So this can impact our urban parkland, and that's really what we're interested in, is understanding what those impacts can be and what we can do about it. So we know we can see flooded landscape, turf, or infrastructure, the increased prevalence of invasive species like Japanese knotweed, which you can find all over the Ramble. Unfortunately, it's really difficult to manage. Increased pests and pathogens that can threaten our urban trees and canopies. Marsh migration, which protects our coastlines and is important habitat for species. Windfall events and loss of canopy, soil erosion, and then increased plant competition and altered regeneration in competition dynamics. So these are all the things that we're interested in understanding, and just understanding the overall threat to the ecosystem services that we get from our urban parkland. I wanted to just go through some of the history of Central Park extreme weather events. We've been tracking back to micro burst in 2009 in the Northwoods. I don't know if anybody remembers, but there was a quick wind event that felled over 100 trees. It was really kind of unexpected. And so that's a significant part of the tree canopy. That was followed in 2011 by an October snowstorm, which is quite unusual. The trees haven't dropped their leaves in October, and so it had a lot of surface area for snow to fall on, and that led to a lot of breakage of tree species. And then that was followed by Superstorm Sandy in 2012, and then we all remember Hurricane Ida in 2021 and the extreme flooding that happened in New York City. We know that nature is estimated to be a third of the climate change solution. So that's just through mitigation. So through capturing and storing carbon, but also through adaptation. So protecting our cities from coastal flooding, and then cooling our cities through shade and evapotranspiration, and then also reducing stormwater runoff. Building off of Sarah's wonderful history that she shared, I wanted to talk a little bit just about the kind of the landscape that was before Central Park, and then the process of creating the park, and kind of what that impact has on how we can adapt to climate change now. So as Sara mentioned, the land might have been wooded areas before the deforestation for wood. And we also know that there was marsh, clay surfaces. We know that at the north end of the park that the Harlem Mere really connected to the East River and was a tidal inlet. And a lot of this information I've gathered is from the work of the Wikimedia Project and Eric Sanderson. But so we do know some of that and through surveys. And I always think about Olmsted and Box's plan as called a green words plan. And so this idea of really creating kind of expansive lawns. And I think that greens word might even mean unbroken stretch of turf or lawn. So this idea that the landscape of Central Park was really undesirable, it was unmanageable, it was inaccessible, and that there was this notion of a nature that could be kind of sort of controlled or kind of improved through the creation of Central Park so that folks had access to it. And so through that, we have kind of the design that we have today with lawns, managed lawns with trees. We have designed gardens. And of course, we know that Olmsted and Box were also inspired by the countryside of New York State. And so really preserving the Ramble and the Northwoods to kind of emulate that experience. So I think that, as we're entering into the 2020s. There's this new understanding, I think, or kind of a refreshed understanding of nature that perhaps those ideas of what improvement might have been are now can also be seen as damaging to nature. So controlling it, oppressing it. And so we're trying to do a lot of restoration work to improve some of those natural systems and reconnect them back with the landscape. So thinking about following where the water would have gone, creating riparian zones, reforesting, and really letting the natural systems run back. And so we're doing that at Central Park. I think the North Woods, the Hallett Sanctuary, the Ramble, the Dean Slope, there's a new meadow at the 102 cross drives. These are really good examples of us designing and working with nature and really letting those natural systems thrive and kind of facilitating them and letting them do their own thing. But there are a lot of challenges with ecological restoration that we're seeing, and specifically at Central Park because of that design process. We have a lot of shallow soils. There's a thin top of organic matter, and a lot of that erratic distribution of materials that Sara mentioned earlier can really make it hard to establish trees and plantings. So that's something that we're kind of working to understand how we can work with. We also know there's an altered soil profile. So soil was brought in from New Jersey for the construction of Central Park. We know that when some of those wetlands were excavated, they were maybe put on top to make hilled landscapes. And so that soil still remains, and it can be hard for trees to grow there. Also just urban woodlands. These aren't first generation woodlands. These are second and even sometimes third generation. And so just letting the trees have their time and understanding that they're also facing compaction of trampling, and it's a fragmented forest, so it can be more susceptible to challenges. And then I just wanted to note that some of the early botanical surveys said that the wetlands contain many species of acid-loving shrubs, and those are plant species that aren't common today in Central Park. So it really is an altered landscape. Some projects that we're working on, I wanted to just highlight the Harlem Mirror Center that is happening up in the north end of the park. I'm sure you guys have all seen the construction, but I really think of this as a great example of designing with nature and kind of co-creating and doing restoration. So the former Lasker Pool was placed on top of a stream that ran into the Harlem Mirror, and part of the new design is daylighting or kind of resurfacing that stream that was historically there and providing habitat and kind of reconnecting the Harlem community with the North Woods and kind of opening that up. It was really blocked off with the former pool. So I feel like that's a really great example of us trying to design in a restoration approach. And then in partnership with the Natural Areas and some of our operations team, we're doing small projects to understand where we can do low mow or no mow grasses so that we can use less intensive inputs that are needed to manage these landscapes, and then also allow for more pollinators and more habitat. And so some of that is just removing non-native grasses and seeding it and fencing it off and letting the grass grow and not mow it. And so I know there's a lot of perceptions about the aesthetic value of grass or not, but we wanted to see if there would be opportunities for us to kind of design or kind of operate the park in a little bit of different ways in some plots. So that's something we're working on. As part of the climate lab, our research, it's quite new. It's been about a year old since I've been at the Conservancy. Last year, we worked with the Natural Areas Conservancy, who had a cooling study with their Forests and Cities network. So they have a network of 17 cities where they're really advocating for forests and natural areas in the city. And they had a study that asked, what are the cooling benefits of healthy forests versus degraded forests? So I'm trying to see if the healthy forests that have, an interlocking canopy, have different tiers of layers of the forest, might be cooler than one that's maybe run by non-natives or invasive species that might have canopy gaps and doesn't have different ages of tree species or different a distribution that is kind of uniform. And so they deployed a bunch of air temperature sensors because we wanted to understand how humans experience the weather. I think when we check our phones, it's that one reading maybe that's happening in Central Park, but when we're on the street and walking around the city, we all know that it can be much hotter than maybe what Central Park is reading because of the pavement and the built environment. And then we also, a lot of the information that people get on just kind of urban temperatures is captured through satellite imagery, which kind of captures just the surface of the temperature. So like what the asphalt is reading and not really what humans experience. So we worked with Natural Areas Conservancy and we deployed 16 air temperature sensors, 4 on the streetscape and the rest within the park. And we wanted to know how the woodlands, what the air temperature sensor was as compared to just maintained lawns with trees versus the street trees. And just a quick finding was that on the hottest day last summer, it was July 24th, the woodlands were 10 degrees cooler than the street trees, and then the maintained lawns with trees were 5 degrees cooler. So that was just one initiative. Right now we're working on just measuring the different runoff potential between different land covers within different urban parks. So that's something that we're working on right now. With that, I'll pass it back to Russell. I think you're on mute, Russell.
There. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you both. Really excellent and past, present, and some, hints at the future and some, scary future possibilities. Just to clarify what you were just saying, Michelle, or overall, one thing you're doing is talking about and exploring ways to make Central Park more resilient. Another whole category of what you're doing is using Central Park as a laboratory to study climate change.
Yeah, I think both of those things are happening simultaneously. It seems like there's a lot of opportunity for us to take action now, and then at the same time kind of study at a larger scale. And I think, Russell, people ask me, they're like, what are the impacts of climate change? Like, how can we see it in the park? And I think something we all really need to keep in mind is that tree species live in larger lifespans than humans do. Many trees live up to 400 years old. And so how they understand, feel shifts in weather patterns might not make it as visible as it is for us right now. And so I think I always just try to keep that in my mind when we're trying to observe and study and kind of understand climate change, that that's a little limited.
Yeah, and is that a mandate that your climate lab has these two functions? Is it sort of 50-50, or how is this?
Yeah, I would say our partnership with the Yale School of the Environment and Natural Areas Conservancy is really focused on understanding the ecosystem services that help us adapt to climate change by different land cover types, kind of focused on that. Also understanding what other tools we can use to measure climate change impacts or observations over time. And then I think also, as somebody who sits at Central Park Conservancy, who works with our staff, taking any lessons that we can and integrate that in is something I see as part of my work.
Sure, that makes sense. And making Central Park more resilient part of it is, it's obviously being done for that purpose. Is it, do you work with other parks organizations in that regard in the city?
Yeah, we've been working with the Parks Department. So we work with the Natural Resources Group quite a bit. And then we also work with other conservancies in New York City. I think all of us are kind of grappling with this issue at the same time. And so we've hosted convenings where we kind of share some of our studies, and we share the approaches. And so I think that we're trying to build kind of a community of practice of urban park practitioners who are focusing on this. And, there's a lot we can learn from our other park practitioners in New York City about how they have started kind kind of facing climate change. You know, Battery Park City is like right on the waterfront, and they're really facing it in a different way. You know, they're not maybe thinking about a forested area and how that composition is responding, but they're really thinking about just even protecting the park.
Yeah. You talked about daylighting, which is, I think, a really interesting thing that, you know, New York, of course, always kind of paves over or builds on top of its past. And now lately people are saying, wait a second, all these streams Sarah, this is equally for you and Michelle. The city has done such a good job of covering up, in particular, streams and rivers. And that becomes problematic over time. And so there's this movement now to daylight them. How much of a movement is that? How widespread is it? What are the problems? I mean, obviously it's a problem if you built buildings on top of what were streams.
Yeah, I've been following a little bit like Riverside, or sorry, Flushing, is it Flushing Meadow Park out in Queens, who, you know, I think that they have a big initiative to kind of daylight a stream, but I think that, you know, it's competing land use issues. There's a need for land in New York City for housing, for public spaces, and just for nature. And so I think when you're proposing that, you're having kind of those land use conversations, but I think there's a lot of opportunity to build consensus around it, to kind of meet folks where they are. And then I think the other, you know, elephant in the room is just flooding. And so just making sure that folks are protected through making sure there's an adequate space for the water to flow where it wants to flow. Right.
Sara, you know, my focus on New York is the history, and particularly the Dutch period in the 1600s, and you know, I'm so fascinated by what was there before. You know, I used to think that all of Manhattan was schist. And, you know, if aside from all these interesting facts I'm learning from the two of you, this gives me an opportunity to say schist, because you don't get to, it's a fun word and you don't get to say it very often. But I learned from your book that, in fact, that's not the case everywhere, that part of, I guess, what's underneath Central Park and Harlem is marble. It's built on marble.
Yeah, it's erodes. And the Harlem Mere is only 5 feet above sea level. The whole East River is undergirded with marble, which is really, it's a tidal estuary. And that's what allowed the ocean to come in. And then the creek that is basically from the East River to 107th to 108th Street was a wide, deep marble-lined creek that flooded into the Harlem Mere as a marshland. So much of Central Park's history has to do with the fact that there's no schist there. And all of the agricultural lands, basically all of Central Harlem, is as flat as a board and no schist. And it was the agricultural land for the Lenape people and then for the Dutch.
And that was my next question, that this human transformation of the landscape of Manhattan didn't begin with Europeans. The Lenape did a fair amount of that by cutting down trees and burning the undergrowth and planting.
Yeah, Eric Sanderson's book, Mannahatta, is wonderful as a resource for me and for anyone who really wants to understand the ecology of Manhattan Island. There's no book better than Mannahatta, and Wallachia, as Michelle mentioned. That is, he goes block by block, and now he's done all 5 boroughs. And you can look at your block and see what it was, what he surmises that the ecology was, the animals, whether it would have been a hunter and gathering spot. It's just brilliant. What he's done is brilliant.
Yeah. And you also then focus on, you know, I love trying to envision what the landscape was in 400 years ago, what people encountered. And you have this lovely passage where you describe, I love these lists of things. The Harlem Flats was the home to a cornucopia of edible plants: nuts, Jerusalem artichokes, wild onions, leeks, juniper berries, currants, wild grapes, mulberries, blueberries, strawberries, prickly pear, gooseberries, wild cherries, persimmons, and plums. And then you go into the game: deer, squirrel, muskrat, ducks, geese, frogs, snakes, turtles, partridge, pigeons, and wild turkeys. So on the one hand, you have that richness. On the other hand, you have the fact that a lot of this land, going back to the Ice Age, was desolate.
Yeah, that was the common land. Why nobody wanted it? No one inhabited it. No one invested in it. So when you look back at that map, that was the green and yellow checkerboard, the pink all around it, and then it doesn't include Harlem, was all private land because it was good land.
Mm-hmm.
But when people talk about the history of Central Park, all they focus on is the rocky, swampy common land, but that was not all of Central Park at all. The west side was invested in. It wasn't inhabited until the 19th century, and Harlem was immediately inhabited from 1637 on.
And to that point, Michelle, you talked about letting the natural systems return, but much of this land was degraded. So what is this? Do you differentiate between one area and another?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are indicators of like a healthy environment that we can be working towards. And so I think like now, I think, designing or operating or managing to a past that, might not have been, we don't know, isn't really like the metric for restoration that we should be aiming for. I think we should be aiming for biodiversity of species, like resilience of plants, soil quality, and testing it. So I think that's really where I focus on. I think it'd be impossible to reconstruct the past of what it was.
Yeah. No, that's so tell me, back up a second and tell me about the Central Park Climate Lab, how it came into being, how big is it? Kind of budget or staff do you have?
Yeah, so it's at Central Park, it's me, but I have a team of folks who I collaborate with a lot, especially in the operations department. At Natural Areas Conservancy, it's about a team of 2. And then the Yale School of the Environment, we have 1 postdoc fellow who's working with us. And it kind of came, I think, through just conversations between the 3 institutions. Natural Areas Conservancy has been kind of a long collaborator with Central Park Conservancy. And then they also, they do a lot of research and monitoring on the health of the kind of the woodlands in New York City. And one of their staff members was a postdoc, or was getting their PhD at Yale. And so had kind of built those relationships. And so I think it just became a conversation. And then we are funded by, and we're grateful for funding through Delta Airlines. So I think that they're interested in sustainability and understanding the importance of resilient green spaces.
Well, it sounds like a pretty a small group of people, but I would think you'd need a certain number of boots on the ground to do this work.
Yeah, I think so. We're doing a lot of kind of remote sensing, so working with satellite imagery and large scale databases. And so I think that's like one part of it. We're looking in the future to, we'll have an intern this summer, maybe having regular intern programs, and then just kind of embedding it in day-to-day operations.
Do you use volunteers?
We hope to in the future. We haven't quite designed a full program yet, but we will.
So you want people to like write in now and
yeah, they're fun.
Hold off until you're ready for them.
Yeah, we'll hold off.
Okay, fine. Before we take questions, Sarah, let me, again, with the history, since we're talking about the history of Central Park, there's so many. I mean, first of all, Frederick Law Olmsted is what is the name you associate with the creation of Central Park, but you you resurrect Daniel Sickles, who called himself the founder of Central Park. Do you want to take a moment to tell a little of that story?
Well, yeah, he's quite a character. He shot and killed a man, and he's robbed the U.S. Post Office. So and lost his leg in battle in Gettysburg. However, he wrote this 18-page paper that's at the Library of Congress, where he explains how he's the founder because when they took the land for the park, they needed to assess it and evaluate it. So in 1855, after 2 years, they came to the conclusion that it was $5 million, and they needed a judge from the state Supreme Court to be able to approve that and make make Central Park official, and to listen to all the people who complained that they weren't getting enough money, and nobody would sit on it. The only judge was Judge Roosevelt, and he was an anti-park person, so they didn't want him. Daniel Sickles, who was at the time, I believe, a state senator, he went up to Albany, found Judge Ira Harris, and connived him through a ruse to come down and sit in the state in New York City in order to hear the Central Park hearing. And so he did it for a year. And on February 6, 1856, he made his final statement that he was approving the report. And at that day, that is the day that Central Park became a New York City park. But it was all based on a lie that Daniel Sickles told to the governor to allow Ira Harris to come from another county, Albany County, to New York County in order to sit on judgment on whether this would be a city park or not. So it's a much more complicated story, but it's pretty funny.
And there are so many shenanigans involved, not just in that story, but in the whole creation of Central Park.
Yeah.
Okay, let me get to some people's questions here. How have the increased height of buildings and the proliferation of air conditioners changed the air circulation patterns around the park, or even life in general on Manhattan? How does the extensive urban paving impact temperature and the ground under the pavement? Michelle, maybe
that's a question for me. I have not done a ton of research on air conditioners impacting the weather patterns, but I do know that the buildings, they do create wind tunnels, and right by the entrance, by the Natural History Museum, actually by the New York Historical Society, there's kind of a big wind tunnel, and a lot of our trees, actually, it's kind of a problem there. They keep on falling because of the exposure of the wind. So definitely they tunnel, they bring wind up from the Hudson into Central Park, and it can be very damaging. And then 100% the pavement of New York City definitely contributes to the urban heat island effect, where temperatures can be like 5 degrees warmer in New York City than kind of in rural landscapes. And so that impacts how plants, the temperature ranges that they're experiencing because of the urban heat island effect. In addition, it impacts how we respond. And then, the thing about concrete, cement, it holds heat overnight. And so really those temperatures are exacerbated overnight, where it's much cooler in rural landscapes. So it's a huge challenge. And we know that impervious surfaces are really contributing to a lot of the challenges with our combined sewage overflows, with threats of flooding of infrastructure and housing. And so really, we want to make as much pervious surface in New York City as possible. So expanding tree beds on our streetscapes and looking for opportunities to plant bioswales or just have vegetation in our landscape. It really helps keep us cool. I feel like cooler people are happier people. So.
Okay, for Sara, how did urban planners decide where to create the crosstown roads through the park?
Actually, it was Egbert Ville, the first designer of Central Park, who in his plan made the transverse roads, and they're all in a depression. They were in a depression and very wonderfully spaced out, but that's the actual topography dictated where the transverse roads were going to go. Of course, Olmsted and Vaux were the only ones who took advantage of that and sunk the transverse roads, but it was Egbert Ville who actually contributed that concept.
All right. There are places across New York that are doing multi-stage daylighting projects. So this is what we were talking about, including the Sawmill River, Harlem Creek, Greenwood Cemetery. Can you talk a bit about how successful these daylighting projects are and any community responses? Maybe that latter part is what you didn't address, Michelle.
Oh man, I feel like I'm not the expert on daylighting. I wish I was. I'm such a fan of it as a practice, but
well, it is a very, I mean, that is the part of what I was getting at with my question to you, that you've got this, it's a nice idea. Let's open up this stream that's been running underground, but you're affecting communities in all kinds of ways.
100%. Yeah. And I think it's like a planning project, you gotta run a ton of design charrettes and work with folks to, I guess, get consensus before implementing any of those plans.
Yeah. Okay. This one, Sarah, how closely does the water supply for the pool and the Harlem Mirror correspond to the original streams? Is the reservoir the only water source now?
No, it's all New York City drinking water that comes in through pipes under the ground. Most of it is not the reservoir. It's all, the third water tunnel is bringing water in. It actually crosses right under the 79th Street Transverse Road. And most of Central Park's water is just New York City drinking water. Very little of it is original natural water. Very possibly some comes from what was known as Montaigne's rivulet, reconditioned to be the lock, but the lock is the only real natural streams. Then, of course, the park also has some springs that have been boarded up, but Tanner Spring inside the park at 82nd Street is kind of a mud puddle, but it was a really profuse spring. There were many springs in Central Park. The one near Huddlestone Arch is the one that still is dripping to this day. There used to be a ladle and you could scoop it up and drink it. And we found the ladle when the Conservancy was restoring the ravine. We actually dug up the ladle and we have it.
So these springs that were bottled up, where's that water going?
Good question. Michelle would be better.
Good question. I'll add it to my to-do list. But I mean, I was just at Tanner Springs, so that one is still there. But yeah, I wonder if some of them were located like where, adjacent to some of the water bodies. But that's a research question we should undertake.
Right. Are you taking into consideration the projections for temperature increases over the coming decades, especially in terms of planting trees?
Yes, we are. I was actually just looking at our list of trees that we're planting this spring, and Natural Areas Conservancy has created kind of like a climate adapted planting palette, which derives from the U.S. Forest Service's plant hardiness zones and projections for shifts. And so we are planting according to that list. And so I'm going to go through and track and see how many are climate adapted trees or not. And we're also, sensitive to what trees are doing well, which ones are naturally regenerating, and just facilitating those.
That's in terms of trees within the park. The work that you do that is sort of laboratory study of climate change, how is that being transmitted? Who's benefiting from that? Who's using it?
Sorry, are you referring to like the research with Yale and the
I mean, how is that getting kind of transmitted outward?
Yeah, well, we're still developing the research. Like, research takes a long time. And so we're using remote sensing and satellite imagery. And so as soon as we get our methods like confirmed amongst the 3 groups, we'll be hosting that online for people to read reports and have access to, and connect with other parks. Is that what you're asking, Russell?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah.
But and the answer is it takes a long time and it's still in the works.
Yep, 100%, but it will be posted online and shared with folks.
Yeah, interesting. Can Sara please reshare the book and author who has written about all 5 boroughs block by block? So Eric Sanderson's book is what you were talking about.
Yes, Mannahatta is the name of the book, but that's all about Manhattan. But Welikia, WELIKIA It's out of the Wildlife Conservation Society. And you can go online, and I've only done Manhattan, but it's block by block. Central Park is divided into many big blocks, about eight blocks. But one, for example, is the Harlemere. But then it drills down to every block in the city, and you can learn all about the trees, the plants, the Lenapes, possible base involvement in that area, whether they settled, whether they hunted or gathered. And it's just fascinating. And the book is like a mystery, because how he figures it all out through one map that is in England, the 1782 British headquarters map. It's fascinating.
Okay, I just saw another list of questions here. Can Michelle repeat those temperature numbers for the 3 different conditions?
Yeah, so it was July 24th, the hottest day last summer, and the street trees, the air temperature was 10 degrees warmer than the forested areas in Central Park. And then we also put sensors on maintained lawns with trees. So not a forested area, but a treed landscape within the park. And those were 5 degrees cooler than the street trees.
Sara, just, there's so many little or big stories about different parts of the history of the park. Can you just briefly say a few words about Seneca Village, which is such a fascinating one?
Seneca Village, well, in terms of the land before it, it was high up. It's high up on a mesa, and fairly rockless. I mean, there are some rocks, but some houses had basements. So it was the African-American community that was property owning, very unique to the history of New York City and the country. From 1825 until 1857, the land was there were gardens. Egbert Ville, if you want to go to the reading room of the municipal archives to see one of the great maps of New York City, it is Egbert Ville's topographic map of 1855, where you can see all of the structures that were in Central Park in June of 1855. Every garden bed was there. I'm not sure he has every tree. He doesn't. But you can really see in Seneca Village, there was a huge farming effort. Also, the East Meadow and the North Meadow were a huge German community of farmers who farmed the land there, which is why the North Meadow was the first northern landscape to be completed, because the German farmers had done the work already. That Olmsted and Vaux didn't have much to do. Seneca Village had about 50 homes. I have done the research on how many would have lived there at their peak, and it would have been just under 200 people. 21 more if you include the reservoir keepers, but they didn't have to leave in 1857, whereas the residents and landowners and all became lessees or renters for the city of New York from May 1st, 1856. And so all the landowners had been paid. Just as a short note, I've done the research because we found the documents of how much everybody was paid, and it was quite equitable. It was all based on location. The closer you were to the built-up city, the more money you got. So the worst land, that rocky, swampy common land on 59th Street and 60th Street, was worth the most, and it got less and less as you went uptown to 106th Street. The people in Seneca Village were paid fairly. 86th Street, which they needed to build in order to cross the park to build the reservoir, was actually ran through Seneca Village and considered an avenue, and people who lived on avenues got more money than people who lived on streets. So there was a lot of people, myself included, that just assumed that the Black people would have gotten less money, and it actually isn't true. It was fair and equitable in terms of location.
Fascinating. Our time is up. Thank you both very much. This was wonderful. Sara Cedar Miller, Michelle Mueller-Gamez. Again, Sara's book is Before Central Park. It's wonderful. Upcoming events in New York Historical's Climate Lab. May 6th, we have a walking tour of the East Side Coastal Resiliency Project with Edgar Westerhoff of Arcadis. June 5th, we have a live event at New York Historical with Courtney Leonard, who is an artist, filmmaker, and activist from the Shinnecock Nation. I also want to point out that this Friday, we're having a Zoom discussion in our Live from New Amsterdam, featuring Chelsea Teal of the New Netherland Institute about the Little Ice Age and its effects and how they changed life in New Netherland and early New York. And finally, now on view is Nature Crisis Consequence, a groundbreaking art exhibit that looks at the social and cultural impact of the environmental crisis on different communities across America, which is very relevant to this conversation. Again, thank you both very much. Thanks everybody for tuning in, and have a good evening.